God's kindness will last a lifetime. Weeping may stay for a night, but in the morning will come rejoicing. I will sing and not be silent. I will sing and not be silent. For God has given me a song. I will sing, I will sing, I will sing, I will sing, I will sing and not be silent. I will sing, I will sing, I will sing, I will sing, I will sing and not be silent. I will rejoice.
Today's scripture reading is from John 13, verses 31 to 35, from the New Revised Standard Version. When he had gone out, Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you should also love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another."
Last week, Molly gave an overview about Disney movies in this century, specifically in 2015. I am going to take you back into the first half of the last century. The movie Dumbo was made early in the Second World War, which incidentally ended the year I was born, so you are welcome. Dumbo was made in the early years of animation and was originally meant to be made as a story toy, but ended up being a 64-minute movie wherein the animation is really simple by today's standards. And the story is simple too, part of its appeal. A little elephant delivered late had huge ears that caused much teasing, and it wasn't until he received a lot of encouragement to believe that he could take flight. When I was a little girl, I used to have dreams about flying on my own. I can remember swooping past the flower-upholstered couch in the living room in those dreams. I believed that I could fly if I just set my mind to it. So at the age of 6, I decided to teach some of my friends how to fly, using the small porch at the back of our house because the clothesline was attached to the house there. Using the clothesline, I tried to launch myself, but I never succeeded. And so dissatisfied was one 5-year-old customer that he hit me over the head with a rake, spilling blood and spelling an end to my promising career as a flight instructor. It's little wonder then that I loved the movie Dumbo when I saw it. It was my favorite Disney movie for years, in spite of, or perhaps because of, its simplicity. And I do recognize that the magic my 6-year-old self believed in does not mesh with the magic I might believe now. Believing demands something a little more substantial than magic. It needs a firm, steadfast foundation, and once that foundation is established, then believing comes much more easily and provides a focus for seeing. In our scripture passage this morning, Jesus taps into our trust in a way my 6-year-old self probably would have accepted, in the simplicity of a love example and command. We hear in verse 33, "Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come." Little children suggests not having them there any more to take care of them when he shall have departed from them. Little children, words of tenderness. He goes on, "I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another." A new commandment, one of loving one another, loving a neighbor, and the fulfillment of the law is love. The contrast between what Jesus said to the Jews and what he says to the disciples is offering a new and different commandment by which his spiritual presence would be realized and proven. To love one another would be a realization and therefore a reinforced reminder of his love. As I have loved you, the principle of the new commandment. You also should love one another, referring to his own acts of love, which would be an example for them. Loving as he has done, he loved his disciples selflessly. Nowadays, we would say he loved unconditionally, without thinking of self. For most, there might be a temptation sometimes in offering love to guess at what they might be getting out of loving someone, however subconscious that guess may be. They might think of the happiness that they will receive, or conversely, of possible loneliness to suffer through if love doesn't work out as they hope. Christ's one desire was to give himself and all he had for those he loved. That's one heck of an example. We know Jesus loved sacrificially. There was no limit to what his love would give or where it would go. No demand that could be made upon it was too much. If love meant the cross, Jesus was prepared to go there, and he did. Jesus loved his disciples understandingly. He knew his disciples thoroughly and completely. I mean, we may know people, but not like Jesus knew the disciples. And most of the time we get to know folks through occasional meetings and are likely to see them at their best. Jesus had lived with his disciples day in and day out for many, many months and knew all that was to be known about them, and he still loved them. Jesus loved his disciples forgivingly. We know that eventually they will forsake him in his hour of need. In spite of having lived with him, they hadn't necessarily understood him. They may have been mildly oblivious about exactly what Jesus' purpose was. Maybe even a bit insensitive, maybe defensive about it, sometimes slow to learn. But Jesus held nothing against them. There was no failure which he could not forgive. It's no wonder he speaks to his disciples and to us as little children, but he also speaks to us as a community, as a loving community, as a faith community, as a believing community. Love one another. These are Jesus' parting words to his disciples. He doesn't berate them for their failures, but rather he tries to prepare them for what is ahead. His promise that his followers will not be able to follow him physically, but they will be known as his followers, is a promise that might defy believing. The followers are reminded of a new commandment, a commandment to love as Jesus offers it, to understand, to believe. The directive to love reminds them that they are a community of Christ's love. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. It may have been a difficult command for the disciples. When we were children, how often were we invited by our mothers to stop fighting with our siblings? You shouldn't be fighting with each other. You should be loving your brother or your sister. Wham. It's just possible that the disciples may have felt that same admonishment when Jesus first tells them that they should love one another. Looking through a 21st century lens, we understand the command because we are members of a believing community. We also see this is not only a command, it's a reminder. Just as I have loved you. We find it believable because we know how far he went to prove it. In encouraging his followers to love each other as he has loved them, he is establishing that love as the defining quality of believers. If we do follow this command, we prove to be believers. He has set himself and his love as an incredible illustration because inherent in that loving others and the belief from it helps us to see that we too can serve. In verse 35, we hear such promise. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. The disciples could very well have felt the fear of abandonment despite Jesus' assurances when he would depart from them. But he gives them a bond, a group, a community by which they would always be connected to him and to each other in the principle of love and believing in that love. In retrospect, it was no easy task to be in Jesus' presence. There was resistance to the early Christians, those odd people who preached love. I can imagine derision in those early days making fun of someone who loved freely and broadly. So different were they. Perhaps they worried that without Christ being with them, they might be shunned. The love demonstrated in Jesus' life and death was an extensive love, an all-encompassing love. If we want to see and be seen as followers, we do it through loving and believing as followers. By this love shall they be known. That's a really hard act to follow. Our scriptural passage is about 2/3 of the way through the Gospel of John, and in spite of the uncertain dates from which this gospel comes, we have seen throughout the strength of the community of disciples. We remember that these followers have spent a lot of time, night and day, with each other. They all left their livelihoods and their families behind to serve this man and should know each other's gifts and faults as no one else could. They've eaten together, slept together, walked together. Perhaps They marveled at this man who had washed their feet, had predicted a betrayer, knowing who would deny him, to nonetheless profess unconditional love for them and urge them to love others the same way. Jesus could not have been clearer. It is not by theological correctness, not by high morality, that his disciples might be recognized as such. It is by loving acts, acts of service, acts that point to the love of God for the world made known in Jesus Christ. This Gospel of John, this gospel of love, is a gospel believed. Going back to our Disney movie, admitting as simple as Dumbo's story is, and admitting our childlike belief in a small elephant who suffered shunning and mockery to triumph in the end, forms the beginning of a deeper belief process. And so, if we are Jesus' little children, as followers like the disciples, what attributes does Jesus see in his little children? Perhaps those consistent with innocence or simplicity? Knowing then that he can remind us and reinforce in us the rock-solid foundation of love, so we can believe. And by believing, seeing. Thanks be to God.